St. Louis is a segregated city. We have a history of segregation. Of course, Missouri was a slave state, the state of the Union, but it was very Southern in its sensibilities and in its race relations. So, I mean, segregation is just part of the city.
St. Louis is definitely a divided racial city. The systemic racism that we have in this society is still here. And even though people may have changed, the systems that they created are still here.
You would have predominantly white neighborhoods, which would have influential people of society. And then some of the poorer housing would have, the minority community, Blacks, Latinos. And that divide just kind of grew and it grew and it grew, and it caused this severe mistrust, this severe, disconnection between community and those sworn to protect it.
We are here because Black bodies keep dying at the hands of the police.
My whole life, I haven't been pulled over once and wasn't nervous. Every time I get pulled over, and honestly, anytime I even pass a cop, I guess, I get nervous. Like, is he gonna come mess with me? Is he gonna come harass me? Come questioning me, It's just something I've been dealing with my whole life, and it's still going on to this day.
When somebody sees a law enforcement officer, that should be a sign of relief or reassurance, that they're safe, that they're protected, that they're in a good space. When we talk to people right now, that's not what they feel. That's what the outcry is. That's what people are clamoring for out of law enforcement. It shouldn't take something making national headlines for us to look at something and do the right thing.
I can't breathe, officer. Shut up. They gonna kill me. They gonna kill me, man.
We have a very fraught history of race in St. Louis. From the very, very beginning, there were these special laws that applied only to African Americans, whether you were enslaved or free. And there needed to have a force to make sure that these laws were observed. You were drafted into this patrol. And if you refused, you could be fined. And this was a way to really have non-slave holding men invested in this system and complicit in this system. So this was the beginning of the police force. And I guess people could see, even in the modern day, you could argue that this is an iteration, because you wonder who makes the laws, whose interests do they serve? Some historians say, well, don't make that broad leap from slave patrols to police, but you could see the elements. And that's basically the origins of policing, at least in St. Louis and in many slave states.
The historical relationship between the police and the Black community, right, has been not to protect and serve, but to control. We are supposedly the freest country in the world, but we incarcerate more people than anyone else in the world. And the majority of the people that incarcerate are Black people. If you have a community, but the police force doesn't reflect that, and we're talking about living in a society that has all these racial issues still going on, how is it ever going to work? They don't understand the culture that's there. To me, the optics of it is more like an occupation, right? Than it is actually protect and serve.
Say their name. Michael Brown. Michael Brown. He's out forward. He's out forward.
Experiencing racism is horrible. When you experience it, it never leaves you. It never leaves you. When people talk and complain about, the racism in law enforcement and how they feel and all that other stuff. Okay, all right, let's sit down and talk about it, because I know what racism looks like, because I've experienced racism in my life. Just because I'm a police officer and I wear this uniform doesn't mean I haven't had some of the same hardships in life that you've had. We're all gonna have the trials and tribulations of life, okay? But all right, the more that we can work together, we can help each other through those trials and tribulations.
We've talked to some police chiefs, we've talked to some police officers. They say I've been on the force for 30, 40 plus years. So they grew up in this pretty on edge time. So by teaching that bias and teaching that prejudice, it's been handed down time and time again. to where we have people that just look at each other and mistrust them for no other reason than that's what they were taught and that's what they believe. What we look to do now and what we're hoping to do is to bridge those gaps, to fill in those holes of information so that we never have to experience that again, because it's not just wrong, it's unfair to everybody involved.
It's a very difficult time to be in law enforcement. The strain in the relationship between the community and the police department is clear. No cop likes a bad cop. That's the worst nightmare for police, is to see something like we saw in Minneapolis, knowing that this is going to bring about exactly what's happened in our community. It affects the morale of the police department. It affects how we look and we're perceived by people. Cops are not all bad. Very few cops are bad. But when one cop does something like we saw, it has a tremendous impact on the police law enforcement community.
They think it's a game! This ain't no game! This ain't no game! They think it's a game!
When an officer does something inappropriate, it makes our jobs more difficult. We don't want officers who don't deserve to be officers to wear the badge. To tarnish the badge tarnishes everything we stand for. We are here to protect the public and our communities, but we can't do it if the community doesn't trust us to do our job. And for those officers that break that trust, there's no place for them in law enforcement at all.
The more of these things that happen across the country, it's just making it harder for the good officers to be able to safely and effectively do their job. They make all of us look bad, and they give all of us a bad name, when they go out and they do, some of the bad things that we see, played out in places. And so, yeah, it absolutely is no room for that.
You'll have other individuals outside of the community, saying, hey, yeah, Blue Lives Matter, and they're doing a great job. But people inside the community that they are patrolling are saying, no, they don't, it is not. Look at what's happened to us. But not until something like George Floyd happens, or Rodney King happens, or Mike Brown happens. And it's like, wow, well, it makes you think like, well, and people think those are isolated incidents, but they're not. Those are extreme cases of oppression, taking someone's life. But there are steps all the way through. There's the disrespect of how that engagement can happen.
Hearing someone and believing what they say is a big deal, because that's the beginning of a relationship. And you can't have unity or any sort of reconciliation without a relationship. Reconciliation's hard at first because that means there has to be a hard conversation. There has to be something to reconcile, and that's challenging. But listening builds a relationship that can lead to reconciliation.
My goal is that when people see the police, they don't become anxious. No one should have to live with that fear. I didn't grow up living with that fear. My kids don't have that fear. To hear from the public that they have a genuine fear of the police is problematic. That is where the police need to get out and have conversations with people and truly listen to their concerns, why they feel anxious. It is a huge challenge, and it's going to take a long time to get there.
Encouraging thing to me is that there is a growing focus on these problems. And Black people, of course, have known about this from day one, from as soon as we hit these shores. But we haven't always had a voice and have always had to fight and struggle. So this is encouraging. Let's just hope that it lasts.
I have seen an anger from people, Black people and white people, in so much that they actually are doing something, which is trying to educate themselves. People are really, trying to gobble up these books as quickly as possible so they can educate themselves about race and racism and try to put these things into perspective. That's encouraging, right? So it's not just protesting, which is important as well, but actually doing something after that. Because if we do forget, then unfortunately there's going to be another George Floyd.
No justice, no racist. Say his name. Say his name.
We can march all day. We can walk till we have blisters. We can scream and yell till we're blue in the face and we're hoarse. But until people actually start listening and opening up their ears and the message falls on people that can make a change, there's really no change that can be made.
If you have millions of people who are crying out, it doesn't make any sense to try to ignore that. When I hear people talk about the protests and what they're doing, what their goal is with it, it's to try to bring that into the light.
I want my sister to grow up in a world to where she doesn't have to fear if a cop pulls her over, and she doesn't have to be looked at as the person she is based on the color of her skin. I appreciate everyone coming out and everyone who keep on coming to all the ones that we had before. This is all we need to get our word out, man. So let's get this thing, be as loud as we can, y'all.
We need to make ourselves more available and then hopefully gain a better understanding of why we do what we do.
Surround communication is imperative. It's such a big deal to communicate with the public.
Don't give up on us. It may seem like it's a hopeless, endeavor, but I always encourage people, don't give up on us. That's really the only way that we're going to make progress is we have to be willing to sit down and talk with each other.
I'm not gonna stop, I'm not letting the foot off the gas. Whether it's a year, 10 years, 20, 50 years, we're not gonna stop until I see change.